your microphone to reduce background noise. Please turn off your cameras to ensure the highest quality of connection. It's important, if you want to ask your question or to talk about your experience, please use the Hangout chat. And it's important also, the conference is being recorded. For the beginning, next, Anna. For beginning today, we will present the latest news about the COVID-19 and the impact on your sector, on the electric sector. And after today, we have two presentations. First of all, we will discuss the question of cybersecurity within the COVID-19. And after, we will do a focus on safety and security question. And naturally, we will finish by Q&A. And if you want to give us your feedback, it's important to say now and with your Hangout chat. So the next, Anna. So Philippe Baumgart present the question of cybersecurity. Sébastien Bianciotto, with consultant and expert on health and safety, present the question of physical security. And naturally, Anna begin, and you can begin, Anna, with the news about the COVID-19 and the impact of the sector with Philippe Bauzier. Thank you, Anna.
Great, thank you, Olivier. Hi, everyone. I'm going to start with some news with what's been happening with COVID since we last spoke. The health situation is steadily progressing. I know last time we talked about a peak, but there doesn't seem to be, we don't seem to have reached a peak at this point. The deaths are about 5,000 a day, and with new cases since the last time we spoke, there's about 300,000 new cases. So approximately 60,000 new cases a day. We've seen some interesting trends with Singapore, which was considered to have really well managed the crisis up to this point, announced 3,000 new cases in just 3 days since from Saturday to Monday. So that's something to be following. Turkey as well has become sort of a new hotspot. Yesterday it recorded its highest total death rate with 127 deaths yesterday. And then this map on the right is focusing on some of the smaller hotspots. I took out countries like China and Iran and Turkey and Europe, which are considered major hotspots, to see where there's been some growth. Again, it seems to be steadily progressing. I haven't seen any exponential growth in certain countries, but it is slowly moving along, especially in the Middle East and Northern Africa. We also spoke about travel restrictions last week, and there have been some developments with Iran started to permit travel between regions in the country, not or internal travel between regions, not travel internationally. New Zealand is considering lifting its confinement measures beginning next week, and also several European countries, including Germany, Denmark, and Norway, are considering lifting some of their most strict confinement measures in the weeks to come. There's also, so these are general trends, and when we spoke last week, we also mentioned international travel. As far as I can tell, at this point, international travel is still heavily restricted, with only the most important flights that are still going on. Most travel to countries is totally restricted, and there is no option. So when I'm talking about lifting of travel restrictions, it really is focused on internal movement. Moving on to the next slide, we also mentioned last week, speaking about the global economy and what's happening. The International Monetary Fund posted last week their World Economic Outlook. And yes, when we mentioned, are we in a recession, we can be considered to be in a new recession. And the numbers are pretty grave. we can see that this year they predict that 170 countries, or 90% of countries, will experience per capita income dropping, whereas only a couple months ago, the figures were pretty much the opposite. We have entire regions like Africa, which are predicted to enter for the first time in 25 years into a recession. The growth forecasts were reduced to negative 1.6 by the IMF for Africa for 2020. And in the MENA region as well, there's an average contraction of 3.1%, MENA and Central Asia. So in general, we can see that this is definitely tending towards a recession. One thing that is encouraging is that while the IMF is predicting this very severe recession, as we said, on a scale unseen on the left since the Great Depression, the figures that they published for 2021 seemed fairly optimistic given the extent of the recession that they predicted for 2020, with an increase in growth for almost all countries beginning again once 2021 starts. So we're going to see how those figures evolve in the next couple of months, and we'll see if the figures for 2021 are brought back down, but for now they're considered to be fairly positive given the extent of the negative information for 2020. One thing that's also just a news item that I saw yesterday that I thought would be interesting to speak about is the oil futures in the United States dropped for the first time into the negative numbers yesterday, with oil going down to, oil futures being dropped down to negative $38, which is not a good sign, but it's partially because that was influenced because the oil futures for May expired today, and so that sort of provoked this rapid drop. So possibly not all bad, although it does seem that the sector will be pretty unstable for the next couple weeks, oil in the United States. So we can possibly see the numbers drop even lower. On to the next slide, again, some news, some of it better news than the news that I just mentioned, with Nigeria investing over 200 billion into its power sector. We see that the Philippines on April 15th announced that they would be providing or paying for the electricity bills of their consumers in the lowest socioeconomic levels for the month of March to April, and that could potentially be extended from April to May as the crisis evolves in the Philippines. And obviously the Philippines is one of the countries that has been, I would consider, one of the smaller epidemic centers. It hasn't received as much attention as China or Iran or Turkey or Europe or the United States, but is still a country that is experiencing a significant crisis at this point. In terms of consumption and electricity consumption, which is something that we also mentioned last week, EDF the French energy company, has stated that it is expecting a decrease in nuclear output. And I think Philippe Bouzier has some information that he can share on this subject and also on some of the other topics on this page. So Philippe, I'm going to hand the mic over to you.
Thank you, Hannah. Good morning. Yeah, I mean, on the impact of the current crisis on the electricity world generally, well, again, so far there is no major breakdown, no shortage of electricity anywhere, but there's obviously one key trend going on, which is a decrease in electricity consumption. What we see is a decrease everywhere in the electricity demand, but in proportions that vary very significantly. We see countries that witness a decrease of 2 or 3% in demand, and some European countries that are undergoing a decrease by 25 to 30%. One interesting consequences in France is that indeed EDF has announced for the first time in history that it would decrease the production from its nuclear unit. As you might know, in France, nuclear electricity accounts for 2/3 of the electricity generation and makes most of the base load. And EDF expects to decrease production from the nuclear units by about 20% in the second half of 2020, which is a first. Other news quickly, well, as we were expecting and mentioning last week, we start seeing that the crisis is taking a toll on operations and reliability. For instance, we have a number of big Russian operators, the TGK, who have reported that they would start delaying the planned maintenance and the repairs on the thermal power plants, because they cannot ensure the supply of critical spare parts, and because the required foreign experts are prevented from traveling to the country. And that's probably something we're going to see in a big number of countries. On another level and on the longer term, an interesting news is that analysts in China expect to see a rise in the price of photovoltaic components for the second half of 2020 because of the decrease in production and the issues in supply. And the latest forecasts are that the price of photovoltaic components would increase by 10 to 15% in the second half of 2020, which of course will trigger additional difficulties for renewable energy projects, in addition to the one we have already mentioned, especially the drop in oil prices. Okay, that was it for the wrap up on electricity and crisis.
Okay, great. Thank you, Philippe.
Thank you, Philippe. The next question is for Philippe Baumgart. Philippe, can I give you the... Philippe, are you...
Yeah, sure.
Yeah?
Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk about the threat landscape as we see today, and how it was leveraged by malicious actors over the last few weeks and months. So just a few figures to give you a feeling about the trend. So as always, the bad guys, if you like, they have always been very agile, and this situation, the pandemic, is an opportunity for them, and they were starting to leverage the situation very early. So we started seeing malware campaign at the very beginning of the crisis, in early January. It was not massive at that time, but it was always there. And then after a few weeks, we started seeing a rise in the attempt, and now we are more or less in a trend where we see a massive amount of attacks. So lots of, for example, domain names that has been created just to leverage the COVID-19 crisis by creating a fake website where you would get some very specific information, but actually the website tries to install some malicious piece of software on your laptop. Just to give you some numbers, so we've seen like 18 million kind of email related to the COVID-19, trying to kind of phishing email, if you like, that has been sent over many different countries. And we've seen also some new attack vectors. So beside the usual phishing / spear phishing campaign, we've seen also people trying to create malicious application for your smartphone, for example. Misinformation, the email pretending that you can know if you've been in contact with someone that was infected. So they send you to some website, or they invite you to download some app that would magically tell you if you're infected or not, more or less. That's the kind of context they use. On top of that, they also use the need for remote access, so having like a VPN access. So they have created fake VPN application. And on the left side, you see a kind of a breakdown of the different type of attack that have seen since the beginning of the crisis. So you basically have all of the usual one. So so phishing, of course, but also denial of service. You probably have heard, but we have been we have suffered a minor denial of service in France. The national hospital have been slightly impacted by this one. We still have all the usual, let's say, the spyware, the Trojan horses, which are, you know, piece of software that just give an access to your laptop. We have a question maybe? Because I hear no. Okay. Maybe we can move to the next slide, please. So just let's focus on the energy sector. So I want to focus a little bit on three recent attacks in this sector. So let's start maybe with one in Japan, which is interesting. So it was in January 2020, and apparently a Chinese threat actor has been able to compromise some of the system of this company, more specifically some email exchanges with the Defense Ministry and the Nuclear Regulation Authority. They also have been able to steal personal data of roughly 8,000 people, but so far no impact on the energy providing system. So that's still not so bad. Also, we have reported incident in the US where this time the industrial system were impacted because the threat actor has been able to pivot between the ICT network, or the you know, the standard network where you just do normal office work, and the network where you can manage industrial systems. And sometimes it's not fully segregated, and the threat actor can sometimes, you know, bounce from one to the other and create some huge damage. More recently, we also seen a European entity which is responsible for the transmission system for European energy provider, to the ENTSO, and they were also they have been also suffering from an attack where we don't have a lot of information at the moment. And the last one is a Portuguese energy provider on which we will focus now. Next slide, please. So here was just a timeline of the example that I just described. So I don't believe we should stay on this one any longer. So yeah, so this one is quite interesting because the level of data that has been stolen is really massive. We are talking about 10 terabytes of data. This is really, really massive. And apparently, this provider, so they have officially stated that they have been suffering from this attack, but they have confirmed that it was just the ICT network. So again, the industrial network was not compromised based on what they say, but still the attack is quite recent, so we don't know much. And the threat actor has requested roughly 10 million euro to be paid in Bitcoin, and they already have leaked some document to put some pressure on this company to make sure they are not really, trying to buy time or anything else, or minimize the impact. And what we know is the type of ransomware that was used is called Ragnar Locker, which is a quite new one, which does a lot of damage because it's quite well designed. And we are not sure at the moment, but this attack seems to be quite targeted, given the level of tooling that was used and the level of data that was exfiltrated. It's very unlikely that it was just a random target. If we move forward, yeah. So I want to talk about also some new kind of malware that just appear to have been used in Azerbaijan, where this malware was used against the government and the energy sector. It's very recent, so it has been discovered in April, and it seems to be quite flexible because the actor has been able to use this malware to drop additional tools to do more. We still have very limited information so far, but this is something that should be monitored to see if it's only impacting Azerbaijan or if it will be used more widely in the near future. Next slide, please. So that was it for the landscape. So now, if we focus on what should be your attention point, it's really around three pillars. So during crisis, you have a different decision-making process. You have simplified things, and it creates, let's say, opportunity for having some insecure setup or some very fast process where you have barely no validation. So this is something to have in mind in the cyber world, where you could expose some servers that are not really secure and create an opportunity for someone to get a foothold in your enterprise. The second one is the monitoring the exception to cybersecurity standard. For example, you can, for some reason, let's say that your VPN server cannot manage the load due to the fact that almost everyone is working remotely. Then you decide to open some service directly on the internet because it's quicker, and this is the kind of exception that you want to track and maybe put it back to normal as soon as possible once the crisis is a bit more managed than what it is right now. And the last point is making sure you have enough staffing on the detection and response team, where in this situation we have seen some clients having people leading this detection and response team being also infected, and as such they were completely unavailable to deliver the job, and the client was in a very bad position where no one was really leading this team, and it could be an opportunity for someone to go unnoticed. Next slide, please. So a few ideas or area of concern were clearly at the back of what we are discussing here. We strongly believe that the governance is really the key, because it's all about processes and making sure we are not missing anything. But besides this one that we'll discuss just afterward, there are a few others. So obviously the awareness of the end user is something that is really key. Making sure you have all your users to be aware of these ongoing attacks, making sure they are not downloading or installing anything that would be a bit suspicious, or if they do, tell them that they should let the security team knows about this. Having some controls directly at the data level is also something that could make sense. For example, if you have a data leak protection, you might have some alert when some documents, some sensitive document is being sent out to the world. Some concern regarding managing the resources that you have available, which is sometimes less than usual. Having some specific detective/protective controls in place, because you are opening your systems a bit wider than usual, then having a bit more controls is something that you can use to mitigate a little bit the impact. And the last one is obviously being ready for an incident, or to make sure that you will be in a position to maintain business continuity, even though some systems are being are suffering from a denial of service, for example. So basically trying to foresee a bad situation happening on top of what we know already. Yeah, next slide, please. So back to the governance point. So if we can summarize what we recommend is, so measuring the risk when there has to be an exception to the normal situation. So making sure we are accurately assessing the risk. Then if we accept the exception, then tracking it in a for example, a spreadsheet or whatever, tracked who has accepted also the risk. And as a second step, monitoring this exception is really something that should be done. And when the crisis is over, then going back to normal. So looking back at the exception file and try to remove all the exception one by one to make sure we are back on track and not leaving any open door. So that's more or less the way we recommend to operate during this time in the cyber world. Last slide, maybe just a few examples of controls, even more operational. So monitoring your exposure and the shadow IT is something that we've seen as something missing in most of our clients, and that's something that is very likely to be one of the starting point of any attack. Just to give you some feedback on the case we've been working on, several clients have been using the cloud, whether it's Google or Azure, but even the team, the infrastructure team or the developers, they want to use this new capability. It's very easy. but it became very unmanageable very quickly, and it's really hard to know what is exposed, what is running, has it been secured or not. So lots of concern regarding, am I exposed? If so, how big is my exposure on the internet? So that's really one of the key concerns, and we recommend to do a regular discovery of your assets being exposed on the internet to make sure we are not discovering anything when it's too late. The second idea is to make sure that your remote access systems are secured. That's a bit an obvious one, but still it's a good practice, because we have seen lots of attack on the Citrix environment, for example. The famous vulnerability is called Citrix, and it's more or less give you an easy access to a server from which you can bounce into the internal network. So making sure you don't have any Citrix vulnerable exposed is something that you should do. I'm not going to go through all of them, but just some other example. If you are moving assets during the crisis, for example, you need to manage the bandwidth or anything else, and you need to do some changes in the network, then track this to make sure you know that you have moved the assets, and for example, the filtering rules might have been modified during this process. And that's something that should be reviewed at the end of a crisis and monitor during crisis to make sure you're not exposing or increasing the risk. And of course, maybe the last one is making sure you have some input, some threat intelligence that you can use to anticipate a little bit what's going on, and maybe implement some control to protect yourself from these new threats, and be in a better position to counter or detect very early something that is wrong and should be addressed. I think that's it for the briefing on the cyber. I don't know if we have any question in the chat.
Thank you, Philippe. I think that there is a question. Hannah, can you give us the question? Or Constance? I saw a question.
Hi, sorry, I have to unmute my phone. It takes me a second. The question I saw in the chat is, what advice can be given to end users through distribution utilities to reduce cyber attack risk?
So, like I said, I think the primary one would be to have some awareness, making sure they are all aware that people are actually targeting end user as we speak, leveraging the COVID-19 theme, and making sure that if they feel they have done something wrong, like, oh, I shouldn't have clicked on this email, oh, I shouldn't maybe have opened this document, they should just tell the security team. They should not be ashamed. It happens, and it happens every day in every company. So clicking on a malicious link is now something that is very, very usual. So don't be ashamed. Tell it to someone, and basically help the company to react better than if they were not aware of this potential issue. So some of the link might not be working, so maybe the impact is zero, but maybe not. So just in case, best practice is be vigilant about this email that you receive from someone that you have never spoke to. And second, if you think you've done something wrong, please let know the CISO or the security team in general to make sure they are aware of what might have been done onto your laptop, and and they could do some checks.
Thank you, Philippe. Philippe, are you here?
Yeah. Yes.
To add some element about that in Africa. Sorry.
Well, I think what has been said by Philippe obviously applies to every operator, whatever the level of activity. In Africa or in emerging markets generally, obviously the threats are the same, and cybersecurity is a global issue. A few things that I could say from personal experience working with operators in Africa is that, of course, it's not everywhere, but generally those operators in emerging markets are a bit less prepared than the ones in more mature markets. And I have to say, I still see practices that are extremely dangerous. I still receive emails from people from employees from operator using a Gmail or Yahoo address, and in this time of confinement, it becomes very general. I've seen cases where the operators were poorly prepared and poorly equipped, and there's one operator I know in Africa that discovered at the beginning of the crisis that most of its employees had desktop computers and could not work from home, and had to purchase in emergency about 50 laptops and configure them in an emergency mode. And when you do that, obviously you expose yourself to threats, and you open vulnerabilities. And as Philippe mentioned already, what we see unfortunately is that a number of operators discover today that the systems are not fit for remote work. So it's not on the operational streams. I mean, the technical parts normally they are ready. We see that a lot around administrative finance functions, where suddenly the operators discover that SAP is not accessible remotely by the employees, and they have to find patches and make emergency changes, and that obviously creates a lot of vulnerabilities. So in Africa or in emerging markets, like everywhere, I think this crisis is a lesson that we should really be more prepared for this. Because when you have to react in an emergency mode, you are in danger.
Thank you very much, Philippe.
Sorry. One more point. Maybe I forgot to mention. There's probably an area of vulnerability that we haven't mentioned. Is that as you know, on emerging markets, there is a very wide use of mobile banking and mobile payment for electricity and utility bills. And it is likely that this will become an area of target for for threats actors. And in this respect, operators in emerging markets are probably more exposed than the one in more mature markets.
Okay, thank you very much. You will have the presentation, I'm sure. Now, when we talk about the COVID-19, we have naturally safety and security questions. So, Sebastian, are you here?
Yeah, I'm on the call.
Yeah, I'll let you.
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Sebastian Bianciotto, so working in health, safety and security. So today I will focus a bit on those aspects of the COVID-19 crisis. So as you may know, health and safety address all the work-related risks to prevent accidents, illness, etc. on site for companies. On the security side, we try to address the threats to protect employees, contractors, travelers, expats, visitors, and customers against all the malicious acts that are intentional. So in that presentation, I will come back just a bit on the context as the crisis really, the outbreak really started early 2020. So I will come back a bit on that. I will come back also on the risk management process that is a bit typical in companies to try to address a risk such as the COVID-19, and then I will do a deep dive on operational measures that I saw in some companies, especially in industries such as oil and gas, such as mining, etc. So next slide, please. So yeah, the COVID-19, so it has changed a lot on how we think about health, safety, and security in our daily life and in our companies. As you may have noticed, not all the companies have taken the same steps to protect their employees. So some companies have stopped their activities, others have not. This doesn't mean that the companies that have not stopped their activities are not subject to the COVID-19 and will not be impacted. It only means that those companies have a different risk appetite, I'd say, that the companies that have shut down all their sites. So of course, it depends on the government decision. It depends also on how well you are prepared, how well you have, how many equipment you have in place, what are the mitigation measures that you have in place, what is the culture of your employees. So deciding to continue your activities really depends on many subjects. But if you decide to if your company have decided to continue the activities, then you have really to make sure that your employees are safe, secure, and in healthy environment, I'd say. So to do that, so I took that big process that is quite common in risk management disciplines. So first, of course, you'll have to analyze your context. So how many sites you have, in which location, are those locations at risk or not? You have to check also the number of employees that are on site that are also at risk, if they have health issues, if there are some pregnant women, things like that. You have also to check the activities that you are undertaking, if they include a lot of interactions between people, among employees, etc. And then you also have to check the workplace layout. So do you have big production lines with a lot of people in there? Do you have offices and open spaces with a lot of people in there also? So these are some elements to take into consideration when you want to address the risk on your sites. Then, of course, you'll have to comply with the local regulation, with the government announces. You have to define some strong objective also to limit the spread on your site if you decide to continue your activities, and you'll have to reassess the risk on site, and we'll come back a bit on that later. Of course, you'll have to plan. Planning means in this crisis period, having some stocks also. I was thinking about the masks. At the moment, the supply chains are really heavily impacted. So this is really something key if you decide to continue your activity. So planning is really key. Then, of course, when you have assessed all this situation, you'll have to take new measures on site. So depending on the site, depending on the context, etc. So those measures, we'll do a deep dive on that, of course, right after. And the second point on that is also the emergency situation. So of course, we think about the COVID, about the people that might be infected, but there can be also other emergencies on site, such as fires, such as accidents, such as attacks, that you also have to take into consideration and to respond, of course, if they occur. Then once everything is in place, of course, you'll have to assess if it's efficient, if you really prevent the COVID-19 risks and also the other risks, and then you'll have to improve over time. And of course, the last point is the documentation. So documentation is really important. So everything that you do, try to document it, because it's better, it's easier to communicate, it's easier to improve. And of course, if the government is asking at some point to show the evidence that you protect all your employees, then of course it will be easier to provide some evidence. So this is just a quick overview of that process. On the next slide, so now we deep dive a bit on all the operational measures. So as you can see, I separated health and safety from physical security and travel security disciplines. I also tried to separate the different phases of the crisis. So at the moment, we're not yet at the recovery phase, but having a look on that is also really important. It depends also of the countries in which you are. So the phase one was the outbreak, the virus spread, so early 2020. So I was working recently in a health, safety and security corporate department of a major industrial company that was located on different continents in several countries. So if you want, I can also provide you with some feedback I had from that experience. So if we start the first points from the health and safety part, so in the spread phase, the first part was obviously to monitor the medical situation, so to analyze the virus, to know how it's spreading, to know what were the symptoms. It was not we didn't have all the information at once, and we are still discovering new parts at the moment. So it's really important to have a deep monitoring of the situation and of the evolution of the COVID-19. It's really hard to take measures against something you don't know. Just to share, I remember it was at the end of January. I was working in that company, and I remember asking someone from the executive committee to reconsider the presence of some employees coming from Asian countries during a major event that was organized in France. So the person didn't want to ask those people to stay in their countries. So he decided not to take into consideration my opinion. And obviously, over the weekend, the situation drastically changed, and he finally decided to change his mind. But unfortunately, the people coming from Asia were already in France, so they had to self-quarantine themselves in their hotels. So there's that idea of precaution that we had to take because we didn't know the virus at that moment. And I think this was really important. So if you don't know, better be safe than sorry. Take all the measures to limit the spread of the virus. The second point was so really to follow the communication from government and trusted organizations such as the World Health Organization. So obviously it was a bit complicated for them also. And for instance, in the company I was working in, one of the main triggers to launch the crisis cell was the declaration of the World Health Organization for the pandemic. So it came late, but fortunately we didn't wait to launch the crisis cell. So this was interesting. So yeah, try to monitor also what those bodies are saying, and try to follow their recommendation. The third point was communicating on basic hygiene measures. So now it's heavily communicated on medias, etc. But at that time, end of January, it was not so much communicated. So we had to be a bit on the forefront, especially by analyzing what was done by some countries, especially China. So we decided to display posters on our sites to materialize distance on the ground. We did safety moments. We changed all the backgrounds on our computers. So we did a lot of things to communicate on really basic hygiene measures that could be done by all the employees, all the contractors, etc. So really to try to stop the spread. The fourth point was to provide, of course, collective and personal protective equipment, so PPE, so masks, gels, gloves, etc. So at the beginning it was really easy. Then after, of course, it was a bit more complicated. We did that by region and even countries. So we tried to support the local sites and entities to really have their stocks of personal protective equipment on site. So it was a bit complicated, and of course we have to take that into consideration in our planning phase for the future. The last point was, of course, to advise the governance bodies in the company on the decision-making process. So what do we do if we have a confirmed case? Do we have to close the site if we have a confirmed case, etc.? And then, of course, over time, so prepare for confinement scenarios. On the site security and travel security part, so we had to also monitor the situation around the world, to identify new threats and also the usual ones that we have every day. So in some countries, we had some issues because the local people, some of the local people can be afraid or can be aggressive against foreigners, so we have to take that into consideration. And in some other countries, we also have other crises such as political or financial crisis. So we had to take that also into consideration, knowing that the COVID-19 would probably make it worse. The second point was in travel security, so to communicate to travelers and expats, asking them to avoid crowded places, to stay home when they come back from risky areas, to take relevant documents with them when they are traveling, so declaration, medical papers, etc., if it's necessary, depending on the country. So we really have that support to the travelers and to the expats. Of course, also the advice on good governance bodies. So mainly on travel ban, on repatriation, on events, on self-confinement. And then on the last point, it was really also to review the site procedure, knowing that we were going to be confined, or at least in another unnormal mode, I'd say, of continuing the activities. So it was a bit of preparation during the crisis, also to prepare for the next step. The next step. So it's the confinement. So obviously, not everyone can be confined. Some people are still working on sites, but for the people working remotely, so from home, we have a new risk. I'd say at least risks that have been reassessed, and some risks can be like the psychological risks. So of course, people are feeling isolated, they're afraid of the situation. So we really need a follow-up by the line managers, by the occupational doctors, by maybe some hotlines also that can be hotline services that can be taken by the companies. So also to avoid the isolation of the employees by establishing some conference call, also defining working hours that are really proper to the employees, so not for them to work too much or too less. So it's really something we need to mitigate in that phase. And of course, the musculoskeletal disorders, so typically back pain, etc. So this is also a risk that is coming back during this period, because people don't have the ergonomic equipment in their home. So either we try to provide them with those equipment, or we try to communicate on good practice around exercise, stretching, breaks, etc. The second point in there was to prepare for the recovery scenarios. So to define also, take time to define the triggers. So when we will be able to come back to work, is it going to be after a governmental announce? Is it going to be after all the schools are opened? Really, there are some triggers in the society that we can rely on to decide whether or not to open or keep our sites closed. So this is really important to define them. Also schedule the recovery phase. So for instance, there are some companies that have planned to reopen their site 2 weeks after the government announced for the deconfinement. So they want to take time after that announce to analyze a bit the situation. Is it going to spread again the virus? How will companies manage the reopening, etc.? So they really prefer to take time on that. Then of course you'll have to define a recovery model. So defining if all employees will come back on site at once, if there will be a blue team and red team shifting every week, if it's going to be progressive with a percentage of employees coming back more and more on site every week. And then you have also to assess the risks related to those scenarios. So with every scenario, you have some risks regarding health, safety, security, but also, of course, regarding other disciplines in the company. On the security side, so there are a few points also, because during confinements, all the security risks are not disappearing. So first of all, on sites, you'll have to take measures, in fact, to continue to protect the site, but also the employees that are coming on site. So protecting them against aggressions, against theft, against intrusion, against vandalism, against attacks, etc. If it's necessary, also, and we have seen that in a lot of countries, you can establish some measures to protect the employees from your site to the public transport, for instance. So, for instance, putting a shuttle in place, having a security guard escorting some small groups to the public transport. So we have seen that because people were not feeling safe, because people were being aggressed, etc. So I think it's really key to ensure the protection of all, if it's relevant, of course. And then you can also communicate to employees working from home on good practice. So, for instance, avoiding a risk area like strikes, unrest, etc. And also trying to manage the aggressive behaviors. So we talk a lot about domestic violence. So maybe communicating on reporting lines, etc. We talk a lot also about aggressive neighbors. For instance, if you have been tested positive at some point and it's known by all the building, then maybe some neighbors can become aggressive. So these are things we can communicate on. The recovery phase. So there are a lot of things that are proposed, that are analyzed at the moment by companies to facilitate the recovery side phase. Sorry. So the first one, I think it was quite interesting, but of course it has to be compliant with local regulation. Is declarative screening. So people willing to come back on site will have to fill a declaration saying that they do not have symptoms, that they have not been in contact with people with symptoms, etc. We can also imagine training, e-learning for people coming back on site. So, for instance, on the basic hygiene measures, on the safety usual measures, on the new measures that will be implemented in that phase, etc. The second point is to define employees who should come back to work and those who shouldn't come back on work. So mostly the people that can come back to work are the employees that do not have the COVID symptoms, that have recovered from COVID-19, that are not vulnerable, so not old, with no pre-existing medical conditions. Yeah, so a lot of employees, and you need really to define that, because by doing so you're protecting them, and you're also protecting all the company, the other employees, the other customers, etc. So it's really also important to do that. The third point was to review the workplace layout. So of course, before opening, you'll have to do I'd say to reinforce the cleaning procedure. So do a big cleaning before reopening the site, and of course reinforce the cleaning activities. So on hotspots, so for instance, at the entrance of the site, on the handles, on the doors, on the coffee machine, on the cafeteria, etc. So it's really something that should be done, and also ensure social distancing between people. So before reopening, maybe remove some chairs, maybe forbid some spaces that can welcome a lot of people. Maybe reduce the teams, train the teams, do some safety meetings, review really the workplace layouts to ensure that social distancing. I've seen also, for instance, an idea that I found quite interesting. So if you have a restaurant on your site, instead of asking everyone to come back for lunch in the restaurant, maybe you can propose some plates to the employees. So distribute the plate to the employees instead of having them coming in one and single area. And then, of course, so monitor the situation. If you see that the risk is increasing, if you see that maybe there are some factors that may increase the risk, of course, prepare for it, and prepare for locking down again the site. So you have to keep that monitoring always in mind. On the physical security side, so of course you'll have to define a specific controls at the entrance of the site's entrance. So are you going to take the temperature of everyone coming on site? Are you going to check the badge? If yes, are you allowed to touch it or not? How will you welcome the visitors? Is the procedures going to be simplified or not? So everything like that, you have to review it and to make sure it's appropriate for the recovery phase. You will also have to review the events and travel policies. So are people going to be able to travel or not, to participate to events or not, etc. And of course, you'll have to monitor the situation in other countries. So of course, to prevent a resurgence of the COVID-19, and also to take to benchmark a bit with other countries, with other companies, and to try to identify new ways of working, of protecting employees. Yeah. So that's it from my side. If you have questions, please feel free to ask. Don't know if we have here. Constance, do you have any question, or Anna?
Question?
For on site, let me check. Sorry, Sebastian.
Yeah.
For now, I don't think so. But if we move to the next.
Okay. Thank you very much, Philippe and Sebastian, for your global approach of security about the COVID-19. Perhaps now, Anna, can you animate the question answers? Thank you.
Yes, so I'm going to moderate a question and answer session, and we have a couple questions that were asked before this conference, but I just want to remind everyone, really feel free to put in the chat any questions that you have. And if you also want to share an experience or give a feedback on where you are, or if you have a best practice that you want to share, or a difficulty that you encountered, especially regarding maybe physical and health, physical safety, travel security, maybe you had to repatriate employees, or you had to adjust to working from home, or someone has to use a personal email address, or the internet connections aren't functioning well, or different experiences that you might have and that other people may be sharing with you without knowing. One of the reasons that we're having this conference is for you to share your experiences between yourselves as well. So don't hesitate to put in the chat if a couple people want to take the floor and share an experience that they have. I think I will try to start with the questions that we have on this slide. Sebastian, I know that you just gave plenty of examples of different health and safety measures, but could you also possibly speak about best practices for working from home in your experience?
Yes, of course. So working from home has been a bit tough for many people, especially for those who have kids. Also, it depends, of course, in which country you're located in. If you have a space to work, if you're in an apartment, etc. So it really depends. Maybe all the good practice. So really, it's to focus on avoiding the isolation of the employees, to make sure that everything is going well for them. So having really the line managers involved in checking that, ensuring that all the employees are really feeling comfortable. It's also having so strong reporting lines. Also on a daily basis, having some news from your teams. It's also about so their psychological situation and how we can improve that. So really, the companies have to reinvent themselves, really to try to keep people involved in the activities, and of course to have them in good health shape. I'd say really safe and secure at home. And then also, of course, you have all those well-being aspects. So really on their workplace at home. So maybe you can provide also some guidance to them, what they should have on their desk, how how should be their posture when working on the computer. So just communicating on the ergonomic positions, etc. I don't know if you have other ideas. Please feel free to share.
No, but I did see that we had a question in the chat, which I think both Philippe Osier and maybe you, Sebastian, can answer from Nancy about the different practices and isolating critical roles. And I know that's something that we mentioned as well in the crisis management session last time, whereas for some of the roles in your companies, there are only a couple people who may be able to perform that role, and so ensuring that there's always someone available for that specific role is going to be a focal point of your crisis management. I think in a later session, this is a topic that we're going to address. So maybe we won't go too much into detail now, but we can maybe give a quick.
Yeah. So I think it's really important to do so if you continue your activities. So of course, when you're going to decide who will be confined and who will stay on site, you'll have to define who is really important, who is really critical to have the activities ongoing. And of course, if there are people on site, you must have people taking care of their health and safety, and also security. So of course they will have to focus on those people and ensure that they are free from, they are working in a free risk environment, I'd say, and they are really prepared to do their tasks without any occupational risks. So it can be done by doing safety meetings, by ensuring that people are not too close to each other. They are respecting the social distancing. They are using all the good preventive measures that are usually taken when it's not in the crisis period. So really make sure that those people are safe and secure, and also closely monitor their health. So maybe you can think about having an occupational doctor on site, checking them every week, every 2 weeks, to check if they have the symptoms, to check if they have other health issues. So yeah, you can work on that when you have determined which roles are critical.
Yeah. Just as a quick note, we have planned an intervention by RTE, the French transport operator, next week, and they will specifically comment on identification of critical staff.
Other question, Anna?
We still have a couple questions that have been asked beforehand. But one of them, the second question, Philippe, you had started to address, or you had addressed it last time, but it was asked about suppliers and clients issuing force majeure notices.
Yeah, I think the question has been asked already, and it keeps coming back, because obviously it's a very important topic. Unfortunately, it is very difficult to answer on a general basis, because it is so country specific and so contract specific, and amongst the people on the call, I mean, we have countries that are on the common law. We have countries that are rather on the civil law or French system, which take a very different view to I mean, contractual and force majeure issue. So whatever we can say will be very general, but whenever there is a force majeure notice by a supplier, by a client, there is no other solution but going to the contract and check how the agreement or the contract addresses the concept of force majeure. If typically a pandemic event or a government decision is covered by force majeure clauses, because it's not always the case, even though there is some kind of consensus at the moment to say that yes, the COVID crisis is I mean, can be considered as a force majeure event. It's not systematic. It's not always the case, and it has to be confirmed contract by contract. And if it's not considered as a force majeure event, then see if it can be covered by a more general clause or more general wording. If it is indeed a force majeure event, you have to understand then what consequences, what rights and remedies are implied by a force majeure event in the particular contract. And if, I mean, in some countries now there are guidance that are being issued by the government on this. You have to check very carefully what the situation of the contract was before the crisis started, because we might find a number of situations, and I've actually seen one in Morocco here, where a supplier is claiming that the issues are coming from the crisis where the contract was in trouble before. So I think there's going to be a very, very common area of litigation around, are the delay or the trouble or the cost overrun or whatever actually triggered by the crisis, or is this just an excuse to hide things that were happening before? And then again, it's really back to the way the contract defines the rights and remedies from a force majeure event. So it's very much on a case-by-case basis, and there are no general approach for this. Again, the only thing we can say at the moment is that in almost all the countries and all the contracts, the current crisis falls under the definition of a force majeure event. It's under nobody's control. It was not previsible. So it really ticks the box for the general definition of force majeure. But again, it has to be reviewed and confirmed.
All right, thank you, Philippe. That's clear. And then one of the last questions that we had received is how to handle the delay of activities caused by COVID-19. I don't know if Philippe, you can address that. I know that our next session, session 4, will be about continuity of activity, so that should be addressed then as well.
Yeah. I'm afraid I cannot answer that because it's so broad. I mean, delay of activities, yeah, there's an impact on continuity, there's an impact on cash, there's an impact on contractual matters. It's basically the core of the issue, so we probably have to break it down into smaller pieces. And as you mentioned, indeed, the next session will be on continuity of activity. No, the next one will be on cash management and then continuity.
Yes, exactly.
So, yeah.
And then the session 5 will be about supply chain risk. So in many ways, we'll be breaking this one single topic down into 3 different sessions to better address, as you said, because it's so large in scope, and also because the geographic scope certainly impacts the response as well.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Perhaps we can conclude. I don't see another question, so.
No, I don't see any more questions. Oh, maybe one more. Yes, of course you can ask a question.
Yes, sure.
Yes, thank you very much. So this is Arthur Norris speaking from AFD. One question I would have is regarding the roles and responsibilities of the utilities versus the government in the topics you addressed today, and not specifically on cybersecurity, but more on the health and safety parts and the rules to be applied within the company. From your perspective and what you see in other countries, should we expect proactivity from utilities to take stance and define rules on what to do, or do usually rules derive from prescriptions coming from governments? And therefore, I'm just wondering regarding, the roles and responsibilities of utilities in this topic. We've seen the solution you were proposing. I'm more asking regarding, the type of proactiveness that might be needed in this framework. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for your question. So I think, of course, the government will do the announce, and I think they will progressively reopen some sectors, some industries, etc. In my opinion, they will make sure that when they reopen some industries, some sectors, and some companies, they will be quite hard on the measures that are taken by the companies. So we can expect that all the companies that will reopen their site will have to provide evidence that they have put additional and adequate measures in place to protect their employees. And maybe we can also expect some controls from the government on those sites. So I think it's always interesting for companies to try to identify those scenarios, and I think there are many things that we don't know yet that of course we'll have to adapt on the things, but there are things we are pretty sure of. Like what we have in the regulation at the moment, with really that duty to protect our employees, etc. So this, we are really sure on that. So now we can with this try to evaluate what we'll have to do tomorrow, what will be our role, what will be our responsibilities. So I think we can start thinking about tomorrow, thinking about reopening the sites, but of course we'll have to adapt with the measures. But I don't know if government will go too deep on what they require, except if they say, okay, you just have to protect, and we'll do controls, and we'll do checks, and you'll have to provide evidence. So I don't think we'll have big issues on that. So we can really start preparing for tomorrow, in my opinion.
We have a question about blockchain. Philippe Baumgart, are you here? I'm not sure. If not, the other Philippe can perhaps answer. Do you have a feedback about this question? The question is, do you have experience in using blockchain in utilities, especially from a cybersecurity point of view?
Well, I'm sorry. I know. I mean, there's a lot of discussions around that, but I'm not an expert, so I don't want to comment. It's unfortunate we don't have Philippe Baumgart anymore online. It's a whole topic, but it's not my area of expertise at all. I don't know if there's anyone else on the call who might know better.
Okay. We can try to find an answer for these questions the next session. Perhaps it's very interesting. No other question. So we can conclude and to say thank you very much for your participation. Our next session will be broadcast on Thursday. The subject is emergency cash flow risk and feedbacks. If you would like to include your colleagues that may be concerned by the future topic, please share the email address for them to register for the next session. And the other session will be about the continuity of activity and feedback, contribution from RTE, and after we have a supply chain risk, and the last session is about crisis communication risk and feedbacks. So thank you very much, and I hope we can discuss with you on Thursday. Thank you very much.